What if a detective uncovered a murder that wasn't just about a husband's lies, but a web of secrets tying a family to a deadly conspiracy? This is a story of a murder that shattered a picture-perfect family, a detective who refuses to stop asking questions, and a trail of secrets leading to a chilling conspiracy no one saw coming. The Sullivan home was a picture of suburban perfection, a white picket fence, neatly trimmed hedges, and flower beds blooming with vibrant petunias. Detective Eleanor Hart stepped out of her car, the bitter November wind tugging at her coat. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars reflected off the windows, casting the house in an eerie glow. She ducked under the yellow crime scene tape, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The quiet murmurs of curious neighbors buzzed in the background. To them, this was a spectacle, but Eleanor knew better. Tragedy didn't belong on a stage. Detective called Officer Grant, his face pale. He motioned her toward the front door. "It's bad." Inside, the air was heavy with a metallic tang of blood. The Sullivan living room was immaculate, save for the lifeless body of Abigail Sullivan sprawled on the beige carpet. A crimson stain spread across her chest, her wide, unseeing eyes fixed on the ceiling. Eleanor crouched by the body, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. The room was eerily neat. No overturned furniture, no sign of a struggle, just Abigail, her fingers curled around a torn throw pillow. "Husband says it was a home invasion," Grant said from behind her. His voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. "No sign of forced entry," Eleanor noted, gesturing toward the intact window locks. Her gaze lingered on the torn pillow. Something about it felt wrong, as if it had been placed deliberately. "Where's the husband?" she asked. "In the kitchen," Grant replied. "Says he wanted to stay close to the kids." Eleanor stood and made her way to the kitchen. Charles Sullivan sat at the table, his hands trembling as they gripped a mug of coffee. His hair was disheveled, his face blotchy from tears, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. "I don't understand," he choked out as Eleanor entered. "Who would do this to her?" Eleanor sat across from him, her notepad in hand. "Mr. Sullivan, I know this is difficult, but I need you to walk me through what happened tonight." Charles sniffed, his hands tightening around the mug. I was asleep upstairs. I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. When I came down, his voice cracked. She was already gone. The intruder. They ran off before I could catch them." Eleanor's gaze dropped to his arms, noting faint scratches on his forearm. "Did you struggle with the intruder?" Charles hesitated. I think so. It's all a blur." Eleanor leaned back, her pen hovering over the page. The details were too clean, too rehearsed. Something about his story didn't sit right. She stood and turned to Grant. "Run a background check on Charles Sullivan," she said quietly. "And keep him here until I say otherwise." As Eleanor stepped outside, she glanced back at the house. Through an upstairs window, a shadow shifted behind the curtain. A child, watching, or something else entirely. The precinct buzzed with its usual controlled chaos the next morning. Eleanor sat at her desk, a photo of Abigail clipped to the front page of the case file. The woman's bright smile and sparkling eyes stared back at her, a stark contrast to the lifeless figure on the carpet. Grant entered, carrying a folder. "Detective, you're going to want to see this." Eleanor took the folder and flipped through its contents. Statements from neighbors painted a picture of a seemingly perfect family. Barbecues, birthday parties, PTA meetings. Abigail and Charles Sullivan had been pillars of their community. "All neat and tidy," Eleanor muttered, tapping the pages with her pen. "Too neat." Grant nodded, except for one statement. "Mrs. Larkin, 2 doors down, says she heard shouting last night before the break-in." Eleanor frowned. Why wasn't this in the initial report? Patrol dismissed it, Grant admitted, his cheeks reddening. They figured it was from the intruder. Eleanor grabbed her jacket. "Let's go." Mrs. Larkin's home was a cozy bungalow with lace curtains and a front porch adorned with potted plants. The elderly woman greeted them with a warm smile and led them into her floral-scented living room. "I already told the officers what I heard," she began, settling into an armchair. "There was shouting around 9, I think. A man and a woman. It didn't sound like strangers." Could you tell if it was Charles and Abigail? Eleanor asked gently. Mrs. Larkin hesitated, her brow furrowing. I can't say for sure, but it sounded like them. They were such a lovely couple. I never thought. Thank you, Mrs. Larkin, Eleanor said, standing. You've been very helpful. Back at the precinct, Eleanor's thoughts churned. The shouting, the lack of forced entry, the scratches on Charles's arm. Everything pointed to a domestic dispute, not a home invasion. She opened Abigail's email account, combing through messages until she found it. An unsent draft. Subject: I need help. I can't do this anymore. I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. Please don't tell Charles. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the weight of the case pressing down on her. Abigail had been reaching out for help, but no one had answered. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Grant. Detective, I found something in Abigail's social media photos. You need to see this. Eleanor pulled up the image he'd flagged, a family photo taken in the Sullivan living room. In the background, reflected in the mirror, was a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. Her stomach tightened. The danger had been closer than anyone realized. The interrogation room was stark and sterile, its pale gray walls reflecting the cold fluorescent light. Charles Sullivan sat stiffly at the metal table, his hands clasped tightly together. His usually composed demeanor now cracked at the edges, revealing a man barely holding it together. Detective Eleanor Hart entered, her notepad tucked under one arm. She didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch as she studied him. Charles shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. I've already told you everything, he said, his voice hoarse. Eleanor pulled out a photo from the folder in her hand and slid it across the table. It showed Charles leaving the house the night of the murder, time-stamped hours before the supposed break-in. This doesn't match your story, she said evenly. Care to explain? Charles's eyes darted to the photo and then back to Eleanor. I went to the pharmacy, he stammered. Abigail wasn't feeling well. I didn't think it was important. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I forgot, he snapped, his voice rising. My wife was murdered. I'm not exactly thinking straight. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. And the scratches on your arm? Did you forget those too? Charles glanced down at his forearm, now covered by his sleeve. I told the officers. I got them trying to fight off the intruder. Funny, Eleanor said, her tone sharp. There's no sign of a struggle in the house. No overturned furniture, no forced entry. If someone broke in, they didn't take anything, and they didn't leave any evidence. Charles's face reddened. What are you trying to say? I'm not trying to say anything, Eleanor replied coolly. I'm just pointing out the inconsistencies. She stood, gathering her notes. Mr. Sullivan, we'll be keeping a close eye on you. Don't leave town. As she walked out, her mind churned. The evidence against Charles was mounting, but something still didn't fit. His fear, it wasn't just the fear of being caught. It was something deeper, something darker. Eleanor's office was dimly lit. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the files spread across her desk. Abigail Sullivan's face stared back at her from every angle. School photos, family portraits, snapshots of vacations. In each one, Abigail's smile seemed to scream for help in retrospect. The knock on her door startled her. Officer Grant stepped in, holding a folder. His face was grim. Detective, we found something, he said, placing the folder on her desk. Abigail had a private lockbox hidden in the master bedroom. It was under a loose floorboard. Eleanor opened the folder, revealing photos of its contents. A small stack of cash, a few pieces of jewelry, and a folded letter. Her heart sank as she read the letter, addressed to Abigail's best friend, Rachel. Dear Rachel, if you're reading this, it means I've finally done it. I've left Charles. I don't know what the future holds, but I couldn't stay any longer. Not for me, not for the kids. If anything happens to me, please take care of them. You're the only one I trust. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down. Abigail had been planning her escape, but she hadn't made it. Grant cleared his throat. There's more. The autopsy results came back. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And there's evidence of long-term abuse, Grant said. Old bruises, fractures, injuries that never fully healed. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Charles. It's the obvious answer, Grant said, but there's something else. The bruises don't just line up with the timeline of their marriage. Some are older, years older. Eleanor frowned. Older than Charles? Who else could have? Her voice trailed off as her thoughts shifted to the email draft she had read earlier. Please don't tell Charles the first reached out. What if Charles wasn't the only person Abigail had been running from? Later that day, Eleanor met with Rachel at a small cafe near the school where she worked. Rachel's usual bubbly demeanor was gone, replaced by a pallor that matched the overcast sky outside. She was scared, Rachel said, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. She didn't talk about it much, but there were moments. She'd show up with bruises and claim they were accidents. Once, she confided that Charles had a temper. Eleanor pressed gently. Did she ever say she was planning to leave him? Rachel nodded. A few weeks ago, she told me she was saving money, hiding it where he wouldn't find it. She wanted a fresh start for her and the kids. Do you know where she kept the money? Rachel shook her head. She didn't want to tell me, but she said it was safer that way. Eleanor hesitated before asking her next question. Rachel, did Abigail ever mention anyone else? Someone from her past? Rachel's expression darkened. You mean her first husband? Eleanor blinked. Her what? Michael Prescott, Rachel said. He died years ago. An accident, she said. But now I'm not so sure. The interrogation room felt colder this time. Charles sat across from Eleanor, his shoulders hunched, his face drawn. The confident veneer he had displayed during their first encounter was gone. He looked more like a man haunted by his lies. Eleanor laid a photo on the table between them, a gold bracelet with a broken clasp, marked as evidence. This was found under the couch during a secondary sweep of your home. She began, her tone even. The DNA on it matches Abigail's blood and yours. Charles's lips parted slightly, his breath hitching. It was hers, he stammered. She must have fought back, Eleanor interrupted, her gaze piercing. The clasp wasn't broken by accident. It was torn off, likely during a struggle. Charles shook his head vehemently. I didn't kill her. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Then who did, Charles? Because the evidence is painting a different picture. He buried his face in his hands, his body trembling. She was leaving, he mumbled, his voice muffled. She told me she was taking the kids and leaving. I didn't know what to do. Eleanor's stomach churned. So you stopped her? No. Charles snapped, his head shooting up. I argued with her, yes, but I didn't. His words faltered, and Eleanor caught the glimmer of fear in his eyes. It wasn't just fear of being caught. It was fear of something else. Someone else. Charles, Eleanor said, her voice softer now. If you didn't kill Abigail, then who did? Who are you protecting? For a moment, Charles looked as though he might answer. Then his mouth closed, his jaw tightening. I want a lawyer. Eleanor sighed, rising from her seat. Fine, she said, heading for the door. But you should know this. The truth always comes out. As she stepped out of the room, Grant was waiting for her in the hallway. What do you think? He asked. I think he's hiding something, Eleanor replied. And it's bigger than we thought. Later that evening, Eleanor sat at her desk, flipping through photos of Abigail's life. A faint reflection in one of the images caught her attention. She zoomed in, her heart skipping a beat. In the mirror behind Abigail stood a shadowy figure, a man, partially obscured by the doorway. Eleanor's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a call from an unknown number. Detective Hart, she answered. A distorted voice crackled through the line. You're digging too deep, Detective. Back off, or you'll regret it. The line went dead. Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. Someone didn't just want her to stop. They were scared of what she might uncover. The Sullivan home loomed dark and silent under the pale glow of the moon. Eleanor parked down the street, her instincts telling her something was wrong. The house was supposed to be empty. Charles was in custody, and the children were with their grandmother, but a faint light flickered in the upstairs window. Eleanor radioed for backup as she approached the house, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The faint cry of a child stopped her in her tracks. Tommy, she called, her voice low but steady. The cry came again, this time from the backyard. Eleanor's hand moved to her holstered gun as she followed the sound, her heart pounding. The yard was eerily quiet, the only movement coming from the rustling leaves. The sound led her to the woods behind the house. Her flashlight beam swept over the underbrush until it landed on a small shed. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Tommy," she called again, stepping closer. The cry grew louder, more desperate. Eleanor pushed the door open slowly, her flashlight illuminating the cluttered interior. In the corner, Abigail and Charles's youngest son sat curled into a ball, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay, Tommy," Eleanor said softly, kneeling in front of him. "You're safe now." The boy flinched at first, but then threw himself into her arms, sobbing. "He said he'd hurt us," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. "He said not to tell." "Who said that?" Eleanor asked gently, her pulse quickening. Before Tommy could answer, a shadow fell across the doorway. Eleanor turned sharply, her hand on her gun. A man stepped into the shed, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. He was tall, his movements deliberate. Eleanor recognized his voice immediately. It was the same one that had threatened her on the phone. "Well, this is a surprise," the man said, his tone almost mocking. "Detective Hart, always in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, drawing her weapon. "What do you want?" The man smirked. "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is what you're about to lose." Eleanor's grip tightened on her gun as the man stepped back into the shadows. "Don't move," she warned. The man's smirk faded. "You don't understand, Detective. This isn't just about Charles, or even Abigail. You're in over your head." Before Eleanor could react, he vanished into the darkness. Back at the precinct, Eleanor sat at her desk, staring at the case file. The encounter in the woods replayed in her mind, the man's cryptic words echoing in her ears. "What the hell are we dealing with?" Grant asked, sitting across from her. Eleanor shook her head, her jaw tight. "Something bigger than we thought. And it's just beginning." Her phone buzzed with a new message. "You're getting too close. Back off while you still can." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Whoever was behind this had made one thing clear. They weren't afraid to strike again. The Sullivan woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. The digging crew worked methodically under the pale morning sun, shovels breaking the damp earth. Eleanor stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as Grant approached, his expression grim. "They found something," he said quietly. Eleanor stepped forward, her boots sinking into the soft ground. The shallow grave was partially unearthed, the edges of a skeleton now visible beneath the soil. Its bones were discolored and brittle, wrapped in what appeared to be a scarf, pale blue and patterned, matching Abigail's missing accessory from the night she died. "This doesn't make sense," Eleanor murmured, crouching for a better look. "The body's been here for years. Coroner's confirming the timeline, but this isn't recent," Grant said. "And there's more." He handed her a weathered leather notebook. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Eleanor flipped through it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. "Abigail," she whispered. The entries were scattered and frantic, full of incomplete sentences and crossed-out words. "He's always watching. I can't trust anyone. If I don't leave tonight, I won't get another chance." Eleanor's mind raced as she flipped to the last legible entry, dated 2 weeks before Abigail's first husband, Michael Prescott, had died. "I think he knows about Michael. What if he's next?" "This ties back to Prescott," she said aloud, standing. "But how does it connect to Charles?" Grant frowned. "Do you think Abigail knew about this body?" "She had to," Eleanor said. "That scarf. She didn't just stumble onto this. She was running from something. Someone long before Charles." Back at the precinct, Eleanor pored over Abigail's records. Every thread she pulled seemed to unravel further, exposing layers of secrets. Abigail's marriage to Michael Prescott had been short-lived, ending in his untimely death, a fall from their second-story balcony. The incident was ruled an accident, but Eleanor now questioned everything. Digging deeper, she discovered an unsettling pattern. Before Abigail's marriage to Michael, she had moved frequently, each relocation marked by unusual incidents, break-ins, unexplained vandalism, and anonymous threats. Each time, Charles's name appeared somewhere in the background. A parking citation, a credit application, a lease co-signed years before their marriage. Charles wasn't just her husband, Eleanor muttered. He was stalking her. Grant entered, carrying a fresh file. "You're going to want to see this," he said, dropping it on her desk. Inside were reports on Victor Harper, a name that had surfaced during Charles's initial interrogation. Harper was an old associate of Charles, with a history of shady dealings and a penchant for disappearing when the law came knocking. "He's tied to Charles's business," Grant explained. "And get this, Victor hasn't been seen in months." Eleanor's stomach turned. "The skeleton?" Grant nodded. "We're running DNA, but I'd bet money it's him." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If the body was Victor's, it meant Abigail's fears weren't just about Charles. She had been entangled in something far more dangerous. The abandoned warehouse loomed like a ghost on the outskirts of town. Its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls hinted at years of neglect, but the faint smell of bleach inside told Eleanor otherwise. Someone had been here recently. "This place gives me the creeps," Grant muttered as they stepped inside, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The main room was empty except for a large plastic tarp in the center, partially covering a pile of objects. Eleanor's chest tightened as she approached. Beneath the tarp were blood-stained clothes, a hammer, and Abigail's missing phone. "This is where it happened," she said quietly. "This is where they staged it." Grant photographed the scene as Eleanor picked up the shattered phone. To her surprise, it powered on, revealing a single unsent text in the drafts folder. "Rachel, he knows. I'm scared. If anything happens to me, tell the police everything." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. Abigail had known she wouldn't survive, and yet she had tried to leave clues. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was another unknown number. "You're getting too close, detective," the distorted voice said. "Turn back now." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" "Someone who cleans up messes," the voice replied. "And you're making one." Before she could respond, the call ended. Back at the precinct, Eleanor pieced together the evidence. Victor Harper's name wasn't just tied to Charles. He was part of a larger criminal network involved in blackmail, illegal arms deals, and financial fraud. Abigail had stumbled into their operations, likely through Charles, and had tried to expose them. "That's why she was killed," Eleanor said, her voice firm. She wasn't just trying to leave Charles. She was trying to bring down the entire operation. "But why kill Victor?" Grant asked. Eleanor frowned. "Loose ends. If Abigail knew about Victor, she could have used him against them." Her thoughts were interrupted by a report from the coroner. The skeleton was confirmed to be Victor Harper. The timeline placed his death just weeks before Abigail's, suggesting a cover-up in progress. Grant rubbed his temples. This isn't just about Charles anymore. There's someone bigger pulling the strings. Eleanor nodded. And they're getting desperate. As Eleanor drove home that night, her headlights illuminated a familiar figure standing at the edge of the woods near her house. It was the man from the shed, the one with the distorted voice. Eleanor stopped the car, her hand moving to her sidearm as she stepped out. "Who are you?" she called into the darkness. The man smirked, his face partially obscured by shadows. "The one was keeping everything in balance," he said cryptically. "You don't know the chaos you're about to unleash, detective." Before Eleanor could respond, he disappeared into the woods. The precinct was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Eleanor stared at the evidence board, every piece of the puzzle staring back at her. Abigail's unsent messages, the skeleton in the woods, Charles's erratic behavior. It all pointed to a larger, more sinister truth. But there was still a missing piece. Grant entered, carrying a fresh stack of reports. "We've got an ID on Victor Harper's connections," he said, laying the files on Eleanor's desk. "And it's worse than we thought." Eleanor scanned the documents. Victor had been a key player in a network of blackmail and illegal arms deals. The operation extended beyond the town. Politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement were all implicated. "This is why Abigail was killed," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the weight of the revelation. She wasn't just running from Charles. She was trying to expose them. Grant nodded. "But it doesn't explain why Victor was killed. If he was part of the network, He became a liability, Eleanor interrupted. Abigail must have found something on him. Something that made him a threat to the people he worked for. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was another anonymous message. The truth isn't always what it seems. Dig deeper, and you'll regret it. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare her. They were warning her to stop. The abandoned warehouse was desolate, its cracked windows reflecting the moonlight. Eleanor and Grant entered cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The smell of bleach lingered, sharp and acrid. In the center of the room, a single file box sat on a metal table. Inside were documents, photos, financial records, and emails connecting Charles and Victor to the larger network. But what caught Eleanor's attention was a handwritten note at the bottom of the pile. "You can't save everyone, Detective. Some things are better left buried." As she studied the note, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Eleanor drew her gun, signaling Grant to follow. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint creak of a door opening. "Stay here," Eleanor whispered to Grant, moving toward the sound. She found herself in a narrow hallway leading to a storage room. The door was ajar, and inside stood the man with the distorted voice. He turned to face her, his expression calm but chilling. "I warned you," he said, his voice low, "but you just couldn't let it go. Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her gun trained on him. "Why kill Abigail?" "She wasn't innocent," the man replied. "None of them were." Before Eleanor could respond, he lunged toward the door. A loud crash reverberated as a struggle ensued. Grant arrived moments later, but the man was gone, leaving only the echo of his words behind. The courtroom buzzed with muted tension. Charles Sullivan sat at the defense table, his head bowed as the judge read the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. Abigail's murder was pinned on him, but Eleanor knew the story wasn't that simple. The weeks leading up to the trial had revealed the extent of the criminal network Abigail had stumbled into. Victor Harper's death, Abigail's attempt to escape, and the cover-up had all been orchestrated by shadowy figures who remained out of reach. After the trial, Eleanor drove to the cemetery. Abigail's grave was modest, adorned with fresh flowers. Eleanor stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at her coat. "You deserved better," she murmured. "And I'm sorry we couldn't save you." Her phone buzzed with a notification from LifeStory Chronicles. The video documenting Abigail's life and the investigation had gone live, detailing her courage and the tragedy of her death. The comments were filled with stories from survivors of abuse, messages of solidarity, and calls for justice. Eleanor read one comment aloud. "Her story matters. Thank you for sharing it." As she left the cemetery, her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but it's not over. Some shadows never fade." Eleanor's lips tightened. The fight for justice wasn't over, but she wouldn't stop until the truth was fully uncovered. Months later, Eleanor sat in her office, reviewing another case. The lessons from Abigail's story had shaped her approach, making her more determined to give victims a voice. LifeStory Chronicles had grown, reaching thousands of viewers who resonated with Abigail's journey. Eleanor's narration in the videos ensured Abigail's bravery wouldn't be forgotten. As she closed the file, Eleanor glanced at a photo of Abigail on her desk. "Your story isn't over," she whispered, "and neither is the fight." The next notification from LifeStory Chronicles read, "Every life has a story to tell. Make sure it's heard." With a faint smile, Eleanor tapped the notification, ready to share the next chapter of truth.